You're off, Flapper. Okay, you're off. All right. Today we begin with Shemot, which is also known as Exodus, chapter 35, verse 30. Literally, in English, it would say, "And he said, Moshe, to children Yisrael, see, called Yahweh, in authority, Betzalel, son Uri, son Hur, to staff Yehuda." Y'all recognize all them words, I'll bet. So we begin with Ba Yomer. And he said the primary signification is to bear forth, hence to bring light. It is to shed light on the subject. Moshe. So you remember in Hebrew, whoever speaks, they give the name after they say he spoke. So, and he said Moshe means that, and Moshe said. I wouldn't have to tell you that if Americans would just speak English the right way. Anyway, Moshe, and this is El, which just means, we would say T-O. Moshe said to B'nai, which is the children of Yisrael. So he said to them, Re'u, see, do you see it? This word is said of to see the face of a king. That, of course, means that it is said of ministers who are received in his presence. You know, that's a holdover from for sure, the Dark Ages when kings, and I'm sure in some cultures it predates them, but my imagination is always in the Dark Ages. From the movies, you saw the king would sit there with his little scepter in his hand and they would announce somebody, and if the king turned it one way, they took the person out and killed him. And if he turned it the other way, he was admitted into the presence of the king. So that explanation is still kind of a holdover from that very idea. So, but this is of the people who are said to, usually used of people who minister to the king. It's said of them that they are seen by the king. Then it says kara, which is literally called. It's to cry out, to call out. It's used of the cry of beasts, the outcry, and it's used of weeping. It is used absolutely of any kind of cry, even when not articulate. A groan would be, they would use the word kara, even of that. But if you were talking to a large audience and you raised your voice because you wanted to be heard, that's kara. If you raised your voice while you were preaching because you got excited, like you see the preachers do, that's kara, And honestly, when I read these verses where Moshe is kara to the people, I think he was excited about this stuff, and I think he raised his voice probably not out of need, because there was a large audience and they didn't have speakers, Rob. Yeah, but where they were, it was like an amphitheater where you could hear a pin drop, So part of the raising the voice sure would no doubt be so that you could be heard by the people way off in the cheap seats. But for the most part, if he's raising his voice and they're using kara, it's because he's either raising it because he's angry, see there's a passion behind that, or he's raising it because he's really excited about what is going on, and that's a passion behind that. But there's the whole idea, though, is that there's a passion behind it. So whether it's positive or negative, that depends on the situation. The word is used of both ways. And so then he cries out the proper name of God, which is, of course, Yahweh. And we bow our heads. There's no command in God's word that says you have to bow your head when God's name is spoken. There is no command in God's word that says somebody can't speak God's name. There's no command in God's word that says only the high priest can say God's name only one time, But superstition started that. people got to talking, well, you can't take God's name. Literally in Hebrew, it says to vain. It doesn't say in vain. It says to vain. So you can't take it for some vain purpose. You can't make God's name unimportant, right? And so once the Jewish way of thinking departed from the Jewish people, and yes, that happened. It's called Hellenization. Josephus, who is a hero of the Jewish nation, and frankly, I like his stuff too. He's one of the most accurate, if not the most accurate historian that's ever lived. I mean, people talked he was a turncoat. Yes. He turned his back on his own nation. He let the whole group of people commit suicide, and he was supposed to be the last one who killed himself so that, they didn't have to bear the punishment of committing murder, because murder is to kill somebody without, who has not committed a crime, if you will. And when you're killing yourself, the thinking, Hellenization, obviously, that thinking was, well, if I kill myself, then I've murdered somebody that, I've murdered somebody. I haven't killed myself because I've done some bad thing. But so when the Jews got in that situation where it was either they were going to be slaves to the Romans or die free men, one man would kill the first guy and the next guy would kill that guy. And the thinking was that way you were being punished for the sin of committing murder. But then when you got to the last guy, he had to kill himself and there was no one to murder him. Josephus decided to be the only one that walked out of that place alive. And then he became a historian and a patsy for the Romans. And so because he did that, the Jewish people over several centuries, they did not talk highly of him. They did not think highly of him. But as time went on and people began to excavate Israel, particularly after Israel won at least part of its land back, they started finding out that the explanations left by Josephus, for instance, one of the things that the Jews used to gripe about as proof of Josephus not being worth reading was that Josephus talked about a hill called Gamala or Gamal or Gamlal. It's a form of the word Gimel, which is camel, and they called it Camel's Hump. And I can't remember the exact name of it. But Josephus talked about this place. He talked about the Romans surrounding this place, and they were trying to get the Jews to surrender, and the Jews refused to surrender. And the Jews had built their housing like a staircase going up the side of this fairly significant hill. And I mean, not so sure I'd call it a mountain, but it's up, it's like when you're up in the mountains and you got the hills at the top, it's that sort of thing. But there was no evidence of it, certainly no archaeological evidence. And then one day there was a Jewish man out surveying for some road construction, and he turned around and was thinking to himself, that hill right there looks just like a camel's hump, because that's how Josephus had described it. And he thought to himself, I wonder if that could be the hill that Josephus spoke about. And they showed it on the video as I was watching this video, and it really did look different than a normal hill. It really did look like the hump of a camel. And so he went and told somebody at Hebrew University, I think, that they went out there, and lo and behold, they started excavating, and sure enough, here's the place he talked about. Well, the story as the Romans told it, there was something like 3,000 Jews at the top of this mountain, and the Romans, or maybe it was 300. Please don't quote me on this stuff because my memory's not serving real well. I haven't read it recently. This is from years ago. But let's just throw some numbers out here to kind of throw the idea. let's say there were 300, it was said that there were 300 Jews, and then there were, or no, I think the way it was, there were 3,000 Jews, but there were only 300 Romans, and the Romans stormed up the mountain, because they got to looking at it, and they said, well, you know, we can just climb over the top of those houses like a staircase and get to the Jews at the top. But what they didn't think about was when the Romans went up over the top of those houses, it couldn't hold that much weight because they all went at once. Well, the houses caved in, and the Romans, most of them died just from that. You know, everything just coming down on top of everybody. But the truth of it was, as Josephus had laid it out, there were only about 30 Jews, and there was something like 3,000 Romans, and basically the Romans killed themselves, you know, trying to get to 30 Jews who had already committed suicide. They had all jumped off the other side of the mountain. Well, there was no evidence of that in any Roman history, because the Romans aren't going to tell their history that way, right? And so what Josephus wrote didn't match up with Roman history. It didn't match up with any archaeological knowledge that they had. There weren't any maps that talked about this place called Gamal or whatever it was. And then, sure enough, when that man that was surveying for the road found that, and the excavation came along, they found the bodies of about 30 Jews who had obviously jumped off the other end of the mountain, and the bodies of about 3,000 Roman soldiers that had all died from the cave-in. Not the way the story was told in the Roman history books, but it is the way Josephus told it, and it turned out to be the truth. Another thing they complained about Josephus was he talked about there being a trumpeting stone at the top of the temple where the trumpeter stood. No evidence of that, no talk of that in the Talmud and places like that. And then one day, the rain causes a cave-in by the side of the temple, and the earth opens up, and 30 feet below the ground level, there was a trumpeting stone right below the very place that Josephus said it would be, or said it was. After a while, after a whole chain of events like that, people began to realize that he may have been a turncoat and basically sleaze of a man who divorced a woman because she was a bad cook. You know, he may have been all those things. But one thing you couldn't say about him anymore was you couldn't say he was a liar, and you couldn't say he wasn't accurate, because it turned out he was a truthful man, and he was accurate. So I started off talking about the name of Yahweh. In the time of the first century, there's some people that push this thinking back into the first century. I don't really see the evidence of it. I think it's more of you believe it, so you see it in places that it actually doesn't exist. This is real common for people at large. For instance, all of Christendom thinks that there was such thing as a church at the time of Jesus, that when he died, his disciples went out and started a church. Well, the word church didn't even exist until the 1100s. This is 1100 years after the cross. Well, they just called it something else. Yeah, they called it the Adah. Or when Hellenization came along, they changed the name Adah to synagogue. The Christian religion didn't exist until the 1500s. Yeah, but it's an offshoot of the Catholicism. Yeah, but Catholicism, that didn't start until the 350s. So you're talking literally a little over 300 years after the cross, that religion began, and not before. But you know, you got all the anti-Nicene fathers and blah, blah, blah. That throws it all the way back to 150 AD, AD. Sorry, you're still not getting to the first century. Yep, there's all those Christians that were persecuted. No, that's not what happened. They were all Jews that were persecuted. Jews who believed that Yeshua was the Messiah. Those are the people who were persecuted. Christians did not exist. Catholicism did not exist. No part of it existed. You had a group of philosophers who went around using Jewish religious documentation to create what eventually became Catholicism. They were there. They're the ones we call, well, they're the ones Christianity calls the church fathers. They were not religious leaders. They were philosophical exegetes. They weren't leaders of anything. They read these papers, these documents that Christians now call the Old Testament, because in their day, they didn't all come as a nice, neat little book. They came, every little, what we call book now, the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, those were scrolls, individual scrolls. And most people didn't own more than one. In fact, most people didn't own one. They didn't own any of them. It was mostly the reason why you had to go to a synagogue or go to a place where a philosopher could stand there and read one and tell you what his philosophy, his philosophical interpretation was. Josephus was kind of one of those philosophers. He even talked about being a philosopher in his own writings. But in their time, in the time of Yeshua, saying God's name, nobody had a problem with it. Nobody. Not only did foreign kings know the name of God, foreign slaves knew and out loud verbally spoke the name of God. And we have evidence of that in the New Testament letters. A foreign slave spoke God's name. Somehow could read a Hebrew scroll. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. But these people didn't have a problem with saying God's name. None of the writers of what is now called the Old Testament by Christians, none of those writers, not one of them had a problem with writing God's name, knowing that people were going to, well, I don't know, maybe they didn't know people were going to read them. The later ones would have, because they all grew up reading, the earlier prophets like Moshe. But nobody had a problem with that. And then when Hellenization came along, when people stopped thinking like Jews and began to think like philosophers, all of a sudden they're like, oh, we can't take God's name in vain. What if we're not in the right attitude? What if we're happy, but it's happy for the wrong reason? What if we're just not really paying attention and we say God's name? We might make it vain. So, OMG, we can't say God's name anymore. Because in Hellenization, in the Hellenized world, the word name took on a whole different meaning. Because in the Jewish world, your name was your authority. The guy that they called Job, Yov or Eov, was it, those Yov or Eov would have been the way it was pronounced by the Jews before. Maybe not as slowly as I just said it, but you get the idea. That man may well have been named Abraham. He may have been named Yeshayahu. Nobody knows what his real name was. But the totality of his life was connected to the idea of Yov, of a man that had been attacked by an enemy and conquered that enemy. And so the totality, the authority, the name of that man's life was Yov. You ever wonder how everybody in the Bible seems to have a name that matches the totality of their life? That's kind of how it works. Well, actually, that's exactly how it worked. Did the man really exist and did those things really happen? Maybe, maybe not. It doesn't make any difference. When you're telling a story, in particular, when that story is a mashal or a parable in English, mashal in Hebrew, when you're telling that, it doesn't have to be a true story that took place on February 25th of 1842. You know, they're not trying to tell you, even when you're telling a story where some particular person really did live and certain things in the story really did happen to the person, when you're turning it into a mashal, when you're turning it into the totality of his life, you may deviate, I should say, from exact dates, amounts, whatever, because you're trying to tell a story that will teach somebody a particular lesson. And this is very dominant in the biblical text, very dominant. And it was even dominant in the New Testament letters, for those of you listening in that are of a different religious persuasion. I'm just saying, it's in there too. That story of the guy running around in a cemetery that could somehow chew steel chains off of his legs. Come on. It's not a true story. It's a parable. It was a parable about the political climate of its time. And it's why one person tells that parable talking about two men being in there, because his commentary is on two particular leaders. And the other ones tell it more generic and only talk about one man in the story. Go back and read all the different versions of it. You might be surprised. It was a mashal. It was not a true story. Parable. Okay, so the way Jews did things, the way they thought, the way they lived was very different when they were truly Jewish, when they were the Jews of the biblical period. But once Hellenization came along, everything Jewish began to be wiped away from Judaism. And to this very day, you cannot go to a Jewish synagogue and be there more than 10 minutes before they're starting their conversation about what it means to be a Jew and how great it is. Because when you're trying to be a Jew outside of the Judaism established by the God that created this world, you're just going to have to define and redefine and redefine and redefine and redefine. Because, like a wise man once said, you cannot get to the truth through lies. The idea that we cannot say God's name is not truth. In fact, it is the ultimate way to take God's name in vain. God's name shows up at almost 8,000 times in the Tanakh. It's the Old Testament to the Christians. Almost 8,000 times. And we only have half of the writings that should have been part of the Tanakh. Only half of them. Think about how many times God's name potentially was had been written down by all these real prophets of God. Yeah, because some of the books that are missing were written by David, King David. Some were written by Shlomo, the guy they call Solomon. We know this because it says it right there in our Tanakh. In the Christian Old Testament, it says there's a book of David, but we don't have it. It says there's a book of Shlomo, or Solomon in English. We don't have it. And if you do the math, that means they name just as many books missing as we actually have. And so I hope you understand what I'm saying. Potentially, God's name was used in those writings 16 to 20,000 times. And what have the Jewish people done? They've erased God's name from history. Erased it. They took something that was so important that it was written down that many times so that God's people would never forget it, so that God's people would know it. It was written down so many times and used so vehemently, can I say it that way? I'm not sure, I may have to look that up in a dictionary. It was used so often and so much that foreign slaves knew that name and could say that name out loud, and did without anybody ever shooting them or burning them at the stake or telling them they're going to hell for it. That's how widespread God's name was. And now, to tell you the truth, nobody knows how to pronounce it. There are people that will tell you, oh, we have the secret. We know, we know. There's ways to know. No, there's not. We don't have a recording of Moshe pronouncing it when he read the stuff that he had written down that contained so many God's names so many times, because he read the law and God's name's in that law multiple times. So we don't have a recording of him saying it. We don't have a recording of David saying the name. We don't have a recording of Shlomo or anybody else saying the name. We have nobody from that time period saying that name. So the truth is, we don't know what it sounded like back then, and it has not been passed down. No, it has not. You know how I know? Because nobody says it. We haven't had a high priest to pass it on to in how many centuries now? So we've done the ultimate thing. God said don't take his name. If in fact, this is true, God said don't take his name in vain. So if we got it right, if we understand it right, then the ultimate way to take God's name in vain is to get the whole world to not say it and not even know what it sounds like. Congratulations, right? Except there's a problem with this thinking. This thinking is Hellenized. This thinking is not Jewish. Real Jewish thinking knows that the word Shem has nothing to do when you say you Shem and maybe you're pointing at me. We are not talking about my name being Robert. We are talking about when you think of Robert Allen, what do you think of? Well, if you talk to someone that's a total stranger that happens to see me in Walmart, someone might say, "Oh, he's probably a biker." I get that from time to time. Yeah, mostly it's, "Oh, he's probably a homeless guy." I swear, there's been a couple of times we've gone to a restaurant and you could tell they were nervous about whether I could pay the bill or not. You know, because our world, I had this back before it was cool. You know what I'm saying? Because it's kind of in style right now. But, you know, so somebody who doesn't know me might think of something like that because they're just having to judge strictly on sight. Other people might say, "Man, the only thing that guy ever talks about is God." That'd be a pretty good description of Shem Robert Allen. Because that's pretty much the only thing I want to talk about. It's the only thing it's, you know, they say guys have a one-track mind. Well, that's the track mine lives on. That's mine. So if you said, how would I apply that to God? What would we call the Shem of God? It's not Yahweh. The Shem of God is the Torah. God himself said that the Torah was his ruach. It was his spirit. Or is his spirit, I should say. It wasn't in past tense. It's current tense, if you will. It's the thing that makes God tick. It's the thing that he gave to mankind to help mankind find his way out of darkness. And what has mankind done? It's done everything it can to get rid of it. Judaism follows the laws of the sages who were Hellenized and knew nothing about real Judaism. And they don't even know that. They don't even know that that's not real Judaism. Because it's the only Judaism they knew, and their parents knew, and their grandparents knew, and their great-grandparents knew, and on up the line it goes through the Dark Ages all the way up to 150, 200 years before the time of the cross, before the first century. That's when Hellenization took over the Jewish world. And to know what real Judaism is, you have to go beyond that, all the way back to the Tanakh, the Old Testament. That's real Judaism. And in that world, they said God's name. Now, as far as how to pronounce it, as close as I can get it, and I honestly believe that this is as close as anybody else can get it, there are those who try to put a sound in it, and those who try to add other vowels and consonants to it, and they have their reasons, and they've got the gnosis, you know, they have the secret knowledge, so they know for sure. But if you just, you know, speak Hebrew and can read Hebrew and actually understand what it says when you read it, Yahweh is as close as you're going to get. And do you have to bow your head? No. No. I would think that it would be better for you to look up. But that would almost indicate that that's the only place he is. Which I don't believe. I like the bowing of the head. I think that it shows respect. It's kind of like, you know, you can't bow down to any other idol, so why not bow to God? You know, I like that, but it's not a law, and I certainly don't have to have my head covered when I do it, right? I don't know why I went off on all of that. I just think that we need to know that the name of God is called the Torah. It's the and in the New Testament, one of the writers of that New Testament said it's more than that. And this is a first century rabbi. He was a what we now say Pharisaic. He was a Perushim Rabbi. He was a Pharisaic rabbi. I mean, you talk about somebody of high breeding. This guy's father and grandfather were Pharisaic rabbim, and they were all trained by Gamliel himself, the Gamliel. He said that it's not just the Torah. He said it is the entire Tanakh. He said the entire Tanakh is the Ruach Elohim. It's the Spirit of God, the entire thing. I agree with him. I think the whole thing that we have, as we know it in Hebrew, not English, but in Hebrew, really does lay out the things that make God tick. I do. I think that what he said is great. Anyway, so we have to know that when it says, in this case, Yahweh Beshem, the authority of God, it's not the name Yahweh, it's God's authority. It's what makes God tick. It's the word that you can sum up I'm going to call it person, for lack of a better word, the person of God Almighty. That word is not Yahweh. Well, it's Yahweh, sure, but that word to me is really more Torah than Yahweh itself. But they've given it Yahweh because he's eternal. Yahweh literally means was, is, will be. And, by the way, that word is both masculine and feminine. Just thought I'd throw that in there. So it says Yahweh B'Shem. That's followed up by Bet Zalel. This is a guy, a person, and he was he was son, the son, Uri. Uri, Shir, Dabe, Ri. Those, right? You recognize the word? There's a guy named that, and they have his name as meaning fiery. So Uri was he was the son of Hur, And then it says le matet. That's literally to staff. And the staff is a branch, a twig. I wouldn't call a twig. To me, a twig is little. So little bitty skinny things that are very, you can swing it and make noise when it swings in the air. The things that when I was a kid, your parents and grandparents would pop you with them every once in a while for being bad. All right, moving along. Yeah, but they use the word twig. I wouldn't call it a twig because we think of a staff as something, an inch around or so that you hang on to, because that's what we're talking about. It's sometimes called a rod, more often called a staff. But I guess they're using twig because this same word is used of the ones that they use in correction, in chastisement. So some of those, they were a little skinnier. I have one that you can use as a staff, to lean on. It's also very skinny, and it has a hook in it so that if I needed to get a hold of a sheep and pull it back a certain direction, it would work that way. That's why I grabbed it. I found it out in my yard one day. Went, it looks just like the ones from the Bible. Anyway, then it says Yehuda. So he is either from the tribe of Judah or he is the prince of Judah, because that's why they would say Le Mateh, to the staff of Yehuda. So let's see what it says. It says, and Moshe said to the children of Yisrael, see, Yahweh has called Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Yehuda by name. He's called that man by name. But that man is the son of the tribe of, right? We can compare that to chapter 31, verse 2. It says, see, I have called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Yehuda. It's almost identical, right? So does that mean you have two different things you can talk about? Well, truth is, that's been yes over the years to way too many people, because the answer is no. Of the words I have called by name, Kasuto said, that is, I appoint this day by this declaration that I addressed to you, and which designates the person by name. It's pretty formal, but he's not wrong. It's just not sure why he felt the need to say that. Nachmanides believed that since the Jews had been in captivity, they couldn't possibly know how to work with gold, silver, it must be wood, gold, silver, or wood. He didn't think that they could possibly be craftsmen. He thus believed that the persons chosen to do these things had been given a supernatural miracle. He had nothing in which to base that idea, just what he believed. Really, do you think you'd get slaves and not train them? I mean, right? I don't know. Never had a slave, so what do I know? But these are Nachmanides. Anyway, verse 31. And he fulfilled with it spirit gods. Remember, when you're talking about God, it's always in plural because he's alive. In wisdom, in understanding her, which is, of course, it. It's just feminine. In wisdom, in understanding, and in knowledge, and in all workmanship. So he's talking about this guy. Vaimalel, or I said that wrong. Vaimaleh. That last L doesn't go in there. And he fulfilled. Vaimaleh. And he fulfilled. It's to fill, to make full. The original idea is that of abundance, overflowing. So he's overflowing oto with it. What? Ruach, the spirit, the breath. But we're not talking about Casper here. Elohim. Oh, it says the Spirit of God, man. Guys, filled with the Spirit of God. Wow. Behachma, in wisdom. He's filled with the Spirit of God in wisdom. It sounds like there's something specific, doesn't it? He's filled with the Spirit of God in wisdom. And remember what wisdom is? It's not like, okay, so he's like Solomon, and he'll know to chop a baby in half or threaten to get to figure out which one of the women is really the mother, right? That's one of the reasons why they say he's so wise, because he's the first guy to ever think of something like that. No. Wisdom is of extreme knowledge. It's, if you're a carpenter and you've been a carpenter for 4 days, in the Bible world, you would not be called a wise carpenter. You know, they may call you a carpenter because that's your job and that's what you're being trained to do. And then maybe they'll go ahead and start calling you a carpenter, but they're not going to call you a wise one. Until you become a wise one, you're going to be an apprentice. By the time you have finished being an apprentice and have learned to do your job, and your boss has decided that you are now ready to be a master, you are not going to be called a wise carpenter. See, nowadays, people go to work for somebody for a couple of weeks, couple of months, and they'll go off and start their own carpenter business. And then good people get burned by guys that didn't know enough to know they should still be learning their craft. Anyway, this wisdom in carpentry then is somebody who has finished their education. Their boss has made that determination, not them. And by this point, not only do they know how to do their job, they know how to make the tools needed to do their job. That's what they call a wise carpenter. So he's saying that the Spirit of God that is within this man is wisdom, this great knowledge. It says, Beti Vuna, and understanding, intelligence, you know, the knowledge of. Then this is Uveda'at, and this is extreme knowledge of. Then this is Ve, or Uveho, which is, and in all, Melachah. These are handmade items. It's service, hence work prescribed to anyone. But especially it is of the work of an artisan. So it's saying that this man is he's a craftsman to the nth degree. He is an extreme craftsman. He's not going to come over and patch that hole in your wall. He's going to come over and turn your place into a work of art, right? This is the extreme makeover edition, people. All right, so our translation, and he has filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom and understanding and knowledge, and in all craftsmanship. Now let's compare that to, and I will make him complete in the Spirit of God, with wisdom and with understanding and with knowledge and with all craftsmanship. Ruh-roh, Scooby. The words in the Spirit. Even Ezra said that the Spirit of God is wisdom and knowledge. Did you hear that? Even Ezra said that the Spirit of God is wisdom and knowledge. Kasuto said it should be noted that the text does not say the Spirit of the Lord. Are you thinking in your head, isn't God the Lord? The Spirit of God here is not the third person of the Christian Trinity, because this stuff doesn't exist in this time period, right? It is not some supposed infilling of God's ghost. Again, these ideas didn't exist back then. This is real Judaism, not the Judaism of today, and it certainly isn't Christianity. If a man is happy, the Yehudim, the Jews, is filled with the spirit of happiness. If a man is angry, the Yehudim say that he is filled with the spirit of anger. There is no demon possessing of a person's body, nor is this a case of God doing the possessing of a person's body. This man is already a craftsman. Thus, the reason why the text says complete him, God is going to complete this man's talent so that what he comes up with will be the very best the man can give. Still not sure that I'm getting the idea across here. God is not making this man better at what he is. God did not give this man the talent that he has. God did not take this man and make him a better carpenter than the other guy beside him that learned under the same person, did all the same stuff, but he didn't get that special little nudge from God. Because that, you know what that would do? That would make God a respecter of person, wouldn't it? So this Western idea that God gave this man something special is not the way we're supposed to be looking at it. What's going on here is that God is recognizing that this man is something else. We're going to put him in charge. It's not that he's the only one that's going to do the work. It's that he's the one that's going to oversee it. All right, of the word wisdom, Kasuto said that wisdom was an expert knowledge of the techniques of workmanship and the ability to use it. That's exactly what the Hebrew word means. Rashi said wisdom came by learning things from others. In other words, it is not self-taught. That's another shading of the meaning of the same word. Rashi is absolutely correct here. The word understanding. Kasuto said that the understanding was the ability to deduce one thing from another in order to solve a problem. I don't agree with that. That's close but no guitar kind of a thing. Or as I like to say, close but no sitar. Understanding was the ability to deduce one thing from another in order to solve a problem. I think understanding is the reason why the person can do what Kasuto just said the person can do is because the person is at the other end of his training. His training is over. He's good at what he does. And because he's good at what he does, he can look at a problem and figure it out. If you haven't been trained, you can look at a problem and say, oh my God, it's the biggest problem in the world. I'll never get this figured out. Probably you won't. Hopefully that makes some sense. Rashi said it was the ability to deduce from that which one has already learned. Rashi's right again. Man, he gets 2 brownie points this week. Of the word knowledge, Kasuto said that it is the expertness that continues to grow through experience. Expertness that continues to grow through experience. I think that's one shading of the meaning, but I don't think that's the absolute meaning. But that's good stuff. Of the word craftsmanship, Kasuto said that the word translated as craftsmanship here indicates that the previous words apply to any kind of craftsmanship. The way we would say it today is we would call him an artist. And I agree with what Kasuto's saying. He's saying this guy is artistic, man. He can come up with anything. I don't care if it's stone masonry or it's carpentry or if it's sewing. It won't make any difference. Even if he doesn't know how to sew, he's got the imagination for it. Kasuto also pointed out that there is a Haggadah, which was written much later in Jewish history, that basically says that the tabernacle and its instruments created themselves. He also pointed out that not only was this non-scriptural, but it was pagan in idea. Rashi believed that this was an allusion to the work of a weaver, though the text does not support his conclusion. So, since he did so well early on, we'll let him keep all of his kudos here. But this one he's not going to get one for. Oh my goodness. I was going way slower than I thought I was. All right, so 32. And to devise imaginations, to do in gold and in silver and in copper. And this is really where we sum up what all just been said. Velacheshov, and to devise. It's to think, to meditate. The primary idea seems to be that of computing and reckoning, to think out, to invent. He's artistic. He has an imagination. Mechashavot, imaginations. Kind of said it twice, didn't it? That which anyone meditates, purposes, plots. It's the imagination. You dream it up yourself. La asot. Man, he can dream it up and he can do it properly. That's to labor, to work about, to make, to produce, to manufacture. We know this word, asa. Yeah, he can, not only can he dream it up, he can make it happen. Bazaha, and he can do it in gold. That's pretty cool. He knows how to smelt, apparently. You know, melt down the gold and get the junk out of it and stuff. Uva kesef, and in silver. Uvane hoshet. Let me say this. I can build stuff out of wood, and I can build some pretty nice stuff. I don't do it anymore. Lots of arthritis in my back, and that makes it difficult because when you're building a wood, you do a lot of bending and stooping. Not good for me. Even if you got a really nice setup where you don't have to do as much, then there's arthritis in my hands. You know, so I don't do the things that I used to. I mean, back when I was a teenager, I used to carve out. I worked for a guy that taught me how to do this, but he used to refurb old pianos, and there was always on those old pianos, you know, they'd have the leaves and like flowery type looking things that were on the posts that held them up. But invariably, there was always a big part of it that had been torn out. Well, this guy that I worked for would pick out the wood, figure out a way to get the grain to match up as best as he could, and then he would carve out the part missing and then fasten it in there with dowels, usually. Sometimes just with glue, Elmer's glue. Especially if it was small, he just used glue. But if it was bigger, there was always dowels. But that guy taught me how to do that. And I did that several times when I was a kid. I was pretty good at that. I couldn't do that today if I had to. That would hurt my hands so bad. But no, it's like, with all that fancy stuff that at one time I certainly could do, and if I were still young and healthy, I could still do, I didn't know how to smelt metal. I barely knew how to weld, let alone anything. You know, I couldn't smelt. So this guy was kind of above and beyond when it came to woodworking, and it said that he was good at it. So here he is. Not only that, he could smelt as well. I mean, this guy is just really must love this thing. That's what makes people so good at something like that, is because they have such an incredible love for it. So anyway, the translation is to dream up and create from his imagination things in gold and silver and copper. Of the words create from imagination, Onkelos rendered it to think thoughts, which is not wrong. But I think it doesn't, what they're trying to say is this guy can dream things up. He can really create from his imagination. And he can even do it in gold and silver. I think that that's a much better way to translate it. I think I can push through these this week. I mean, we're going to go over a little bit, but not a lot. All right, so 33. And in sculpting stone to filling, which is for filling. By filling, they mean setting, like putting a diamond in a setting. That's what they're talking about. And in sculpting trees, or sculpting wood, because the word for wood and tree is the same word, to make in all work imaginative. Everything from his imagination. It's kind of going to say the same thing we just went through. Uva haroshet. You're like, what? We haven't heard that one. Well, that's the new one. That's in sculpting. He's sculpting in stone. He's carving in wood. That's the same word. So it says Evan, like we have a grandson named Evan. That's your word. It means stone, right? So he's good at sculpting in stone. Le malot, this is the word for your of abundance, or in this case, it's being used for the setting, because it's the word for, it's, we would say like a filling of a tooth, the filling, you're filling in the place is why they call it the word filling. But that is kind of the same idea as a setting. You put a bunch of settings on something and you fill it full of diamonds. And so that same word is used in Hebrew that in that way. And this is, and in sculpting, you have uvaharoshet. This sounds like the other word because it is the other word. Etz, again, that's the word for tree, but it's also the word for wood, or the word for plank, or the word for a chunk of wood you found in your backyard. Etz is used of all those things. La'asot, there's your asa, to work, to produce, to manufacture, to labor, to make things. And then it says, Behol, and in all melechet, and in all work, service prescribed, and in all the work of what? Ma chashavet, in all the work of his imagination. So your translation is an abundance of stone sculpturing and wood carving, doing everything from the work of his imagination. We can compare that to, and complete in stone sculptures and in wood carvings for creating in all craftsmanship. So it says the same thing, just in two different ways. These are two kind of pretty different. But again, that's not, now we have one law, another law, and that's, no, it's just a different way of saying the same thing. Rashi applied the meaning of ha-roshet from Isaiah 40:20 to prove, to make this verse say skilled work. Though at its root, this word does mean skilled work, the text of these two verses do not exactly support his beliefs, while at the same time, they don't exactly discount it either. He's just kind of in a gray area there. 34. And to throwing, says, gave in heart he and Ahaliab, son of Achiz Amach, to staff Dan. All right, so we have Ule Horot. This is, and we would say, I think, casting, and in like, what do you cast on it?
You mean like throwing a rod and reel cast, or casting in stone?
In stone. What's casting in stone? Well, this is more, I guess this is more of a throwing idea, like casting a rod and reel. Yeah, I think that'll work. Put. Well, they do that same thing. They use the same word of something that means to throw, like casting a reel, but they also use that same word for laying a foundation. I can't think of a good example. Let's just move on here. Natan is where we get the word Nathan, because when they started doing what's called transliteration, which is not translation, transliteration is taking your alphabet and writing out a word from somebody else's language in your alphabet, so that the person who's reading that word will at least know how to pronounce this word from another language properly. So if I write down Amen, that is not an English word. That is a Hebrew word, amen. But I wrote Amen in English so that you would know that that's how you pronounce the Hebrew word amen. Anyway, that's transliteration. So you have the idea of giving and causing to receive. Then it says be libo, in heart it, in his or he, in his heart. It says who, which is again he. Ve'aha liab. So something is course, that's okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm pushing it over the limb of just a smidge past a hair here. All right, so did I say the guy's name? Ahaliav? I didn't? Okay. So that was your next word. It's giving a guy's name, and he's Ben. He's the son. Ben is the Hebrew word for son. Ahi Samach. That's the other guy's name. Then it says Lemateh, to the staff, Don. D-A-N, Don. That's the name of the tribe, right? So your translation. And he has laid it in his, speaking of Bezalel, he's laid it in Bezalel's heart. He and Ahaliav, who's the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan. He's laid it in the heart. The word, the boys. He laid it in his heart and in the other guys. Even Ezra wrote that Ahaliav was an equal to Bezalel as a craftsman, but inferior as an innovator. As I have said before, this is purely mean-spirited speculation. Rashi wrote that while Ahaliav was from the least important tribe, in other words, Dan, the least important, and was also the son of a maidservant, God made him equal to Bezalel, who was from the largest, most important tribe, in other words, Judah. And thus, this was proof that God was no respecter of person. Or it could be, those just happened to be the two guys that really excelled. Just thought I'd throw that out there. Is this not an oxymoron? If there is a superior tribe, and thus an inferior tribe, if there is a more honorable birth, and thus a birth from a lowly maidservant, then God is, in fact, a respecter of persons. I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that Rashi was of the tribe of Judah. Just, oh, wow. All right, then we get to our last one. Filled with them wisdom heart to make all work craftsmen, and imagine, and woven, and violet, and in purple, and scarlet, the crimson, and in linen, and weaver does all workmanship, and inventing from imaginations. So there's not a word here that we haven't had. Now today we haven't gone through the colors, but like I said last time, nobody really knows what they are. It says mileh, filled. That's our word from the idea. The original idea was abundance and overflowing, and it's to fill something up. Otan, with them. They've been filled with hakmat. So here goes Rashi's theory altogether. Because now it's saying he filled them with wisdom in their heart. And la'asot, so that they can make, create, do things. Kol, all, melechet, all of these items, harash, the items of, that will come from the craftsmanship, vechoshev, and imagination. All these items that come from craftsmanship and imagination. And it says that he's filling them, verokem, and woven, ba techelet, stuff that is woven, that is violet. This is best as we can come up with a color. Va'argaman, and in purple. Betolaat, and in scarlet. Hashani, and in crimson. Uvashesh, which is and in linen. That's not and in 6. Ve'oreg, and in weaving. Osei, can you see? No, the Hebrew word is osei. Properly, it's from asa, to work, to labor, to make, to produce, to manufacture. All right, so there's your to do or to work. Kol, all, melacha, all craftsmanship. These guys have some serious artistic imagination. And then it says, Bechoshvei. And there's your imagination, to think, to medicate. Must be time to take my pills. To meditate, I meant to say. The primary idea seems to be that of computing and reckoning and thinking and supposing and blah, blah, blah. Mahashavot, from imagination. So inventing from the imagination, if you will. All right, so here's your translation. And he has filled them with wisdom of heart. I hope you're starting to get that when you're filled with something, this is an idiom. God has not actually done to, opened up the top of your head, poured something in there. I'm sorry, that's just not the way it works. It's an idiom. And has filled them with wisdom of heart, we'll say, to do every work of the engraver and designer and embroiderer in violet and purple, in scarlet, crimson, and linen, and of weavers, and doing all works and dreaming up designs. I think that's the best way to put it, dreaming up designs. Embroidered and weavers, of those words, Kasuto wrote, worked in pattern of checkers after the style still usual today of tablecloths and napkins. For this reason, the tunic is called, in verse 4, a tunic of checker work. Apparently, this was the customary way of making stately tunics. I don't agree with that. It's possible that that's what they're talking about. But I think that it's, when you put material together, what are you doing? You're doing a checkered work, if you will, because it's going, this one's going that way, and then that one's going that way, and once you checker it, if you will, you've made material. But maybe it's a checkered pattern. You can certainly make a checkered pattern with material, right? Just saying. Kasuto also wrote, the head covering consisted of a long kerchief which could be wrapped and wound round the head so as to give it a high and majestic shape. Furthermore, and Jews did that. That came from Judaism. Jews used to wear the turban. Furthermore, and you shall make a sash, a girdle, which is a belt, fitted over the tunic beneath the robe. So he's relying on Leviticus 8:7 for that. This sash shall be the work of the embroiderer. Further on in, I don't know what XXXIX. That would be 30:19. I don't know what that is. It's verse 39. So it's actually Exodus something, 29. It is stated that it was made like the ephod and the pouch of fine twined linen and deep violet and dark red and scarlet wool. See, here he's saying twined instead of checkered. Thus, its manufacturer was similar to that of the screen for the doorway of the tabernacle. Well, that would be a very loose and open weaving or twined pattern, if you will. But material itself is generally of a much tighter weave. Did I say that right, Donna? All right. Well, guess what? This concludes chapter 35. Shalom, shalom, y'all.